Iron Ridge, Texas. September 1872. The saloon went dead silent. Evelyn Mercer stood her ground, 2 orphaned children behind her, a forged slave contract shoved in her face, and Jebediah Vance watching her like she was already his property. Then a stranger stepped out of the shadows. He dropped one deed on the table, his last valuable asset, traded for her freedom without a word of explanation. Then he turned toward the door and didn't look back. If you're coming, come now. That night, in a canyon cabin deep in the Wild West, he backed her against the wall, voice low and rough against her ear. Your innocence will be mine tonight, she trembled. But what he said next changed everything. This is the story of a woman who refused to break stay with me, because this one goes deep. The stagecoach hit a rut so hard that Evelyn Mercer bit down on her tongue. She grabbed the window frame with one hand and pulled 7-year-old Hannah against her side with the other. Toby, 12, and trying hard to act like it didn't bother him, braced both feet against the opposite seat and said nothing. Smart kid, he'd learned early that complaining changed nothing. Outside, the land was ugly. Flat in some places, broken in others, all of it bleached pale by a sun that showed no mercy. The town of Iron Ridge rose up through the dust like something a tired man had sketched on a napkin and then given up on halfway through. Low buildings, warped timber, a church with a crooked cross on top, and over everything, that wind dry and gritty and constant, pushing dust into every crack it could find. Evelyn had read the letter from the school board a dozen times on the trip west. Position secured. Lodging provided. Start date, September 1st, 1872. She had believed every word. She'd sold her mother's brooch to pay for passage. She had packed her 2 best dresses and her medical kit and her collection of school books. And she'd told Toby and Hannah that everything was going to be fine. She'd believed that too. The stagecoach rolled to a stop in front of a building with the word saloon painted in peeling red letters above the door. The driver dropped their trunk in the dirt without ceremony and didn't look at her twice. Evelyn straightened her collar, took Hannah's hand, and walked inside. The saloon smelled like old smoke and cheaper whiskey. A dozen men sat at various tables. Cards, drinks, low conversation that died the moment she stepped through the door. A fat man behind the bar wiped a glass with a rag that wasn't improving anything and watched her with flat, calculating eyes. The man she was looking for sat at the back table. She recognized him from the description in the letter: big, well-dressed, silver watch chain draped across a thick belly. Jebediah Vance. He had the look of a man who smiled a lot and meant none of it, Miss Mercer. He didn't stand. Punctual. I like that, Mr. Vance. She kept her voice even. I've come about the teaching position. He leaned back in his chair and spread his hands wide, as though presenting her with a gift. Course you have. He gestured to the chair across from him. She didn't sit. I'd prefer to review the terms standing, thank you. Something shifted in his expression. Still smiling, but different now. He reached under the table and set a folded document in front of her. Evelyn picked it up and read it. Then she read it again. It wasn't a teaching contract, it was an indentured labor contract. Her name was printed neatly at the top. The debt listed was $300. Identified as a transit acquisition fee arranged through a Judge Augustus Cole on behalf of Jebediah Vance. The terms were 18 months of compulsory service, at wages that wouldn't pay off the interest, let alone the principal. I didn't sign this, she said. Your late father's estate did. Vance's smile didn't move. To cover the cost of your passage west and the placement fee for your position. All quite legal. Judge Cole drafted it himself. Hannah pressed herself into Evelyn's side. Toby's jaw was tight. This is a debt I don't owe, Evelyn said. My father is dead. He left nothing. There was no estate. The contract says otherwise. She set the paper down on the table, face up, so the whole room could see it if they cared to look. A few of them did. Most looked away. Then the contract is a lie. Vance stood up slowly. He was taller than she'd realized. The men at the surrounding tables shifted in their seats, half of them already reaching toward their belts by reflex. "Miss Mercer," he said, keeping his voice almost pleasant, "you came out here on credit that someone had to front. You owe that money, and until it's paid, you work for me. Those are the terms." He glanced at Toby and Hannah. "Them too, depending on how cooperative you decide to be." The room had gone very quiet. Evelyn didn't hear him come in. Nobody did, really, or if they did, they were smart enough not to react. One moment, the far corner of the saloon was just shadow. The next moment, there was a man standing in it. Tall, broad through the shoulders, lean everywhere else. He wore a weathered brown duster and a hat that had been through hard weather more than once. His face was the kind that had spent years in direct sunlight and wasn't apologizing for it. A jaw like a fence post, eyes that were somewhere between gray and green, and were, at this precise moment, fixed on Vance with the specific, patient quality of a man who had already made a decision and was just waiting for the moment to act on it. He walked to the table without hurrying. He didn't touch his holster. He barely made a sound on the floorboards. He reached into his duster and pulled out a folded document of his own and set it on top of Vance's contract. "Deed to the water spring in my canyon," he said. His voice was low and flat, like a river. "You wouldn't want to cross. Sole, natural spring in this county outside of town, worth considerably more than $300 to any man who wants to run cattle through the summer." The silence in the saloon got heavier. Vance stared at the deed, then at the man. "Garrett. That clears her debt." Thorne Garrett didn't blink, and theirs. He nodded at Toby and Hannah. "You want to argue the math, argue it with a lawyer in Austin. I've got time." Vance looked around the room. Whatever he was searching for on those faces, he didn't find it. He picked up the deed slowly, like he was handling something that might burn him. He studied it. He folded it and put it in his jacket pocket. "Pleasure doing business," he said, and the words came out thin. Thorne didn't respond. He looked at Evelyn once, not long, just enough, and then turned and walked back toward the door. He paused there, not looking back. "If you're coming," he said, "come now." The log cabin sat at the mouth of the canyon, backed up against a red rock wall. So old it looked like it had been there before the land itself had an opinion about anything inside. Sparse, a stone fireplace, a table, two wooden chairs, bedrolls stacked in the corner, a Winchester on the wall above the door. Evelyn stood near the far wall, with Hannah still pressed to her side, and Toby at her shoulder, and tried to breathe normally. She had walked out of one man's trap, straight into another man's cabin. She was aware of this. She was also aware that she had no horse, no money, no friends in this territory, and no immediate alternatives. So she stood, and she measured the man in front of her. Thorne had set his hat on the table. He stood by the fireplace, his back half turned to her, building up the fire with the efficiency of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. He hadn't touched her. He hadn't leered at her. He hadn't said anything threatening. He also had unexplained himself, which was its own kind of unsettling. He straightened up and turned around and found her staring at him. He looked at her the way someone looks at a problem they're trying to solve without any unnecessary drama. Then he crossed the room in 4 steps and stopped close enough that she could see the scar running along the left side of his jaw. He was a full head taller than her, and the firelight threw half his face into shadow. She didn't step back. She refused. He leaned down slightly, and his voice came low and rough right beside her ear, barely above a whisper. "Your innocence will be mine tonight." She went very still, every muscle in her body locked up. Behind her, she heard Toby exhale sharply. Then Thorne straightened up, and he looked her directly in the eye, and he finished the sentence, meaning your naive, blind trust in people ends tonight if you want to survive out here in the West. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he stepped back and picked up his hat. "There's clean water at the well. Bedrolls are in the corner. Supper's what you make it." He moved toward the door. "You're safe here. That's all I'm offering." He walked outside, and the door swung shut behind him. Evelyn stood in the firelight, with her heart still pounding and her hands very carefully still. Hannah looked up at her. Toby crossed his arms and stared at the door. She looked around the cabin, at the Winchester, at the plain table, at the stack of folded blankets, at the fire that was already warming the air. Then she took a breath, set her bag down on the table, and got to work. Out here, she was already learning. You didn't wait for someone to save you. You looked around at what you had, and you started. The rooster didn't crow in the canyon. There was no rooster. What woke Evelyn instead was the sound of an axe splitting wood in the gray pre-dawn, steady and rhythmic like a clock that meant business. She lay still for a moment and listened. Hannah was curled warm against her left side. Toby had taken the bedroll nearest the door, his idea, not anyone's suggestion, and was still asleep, one arm thrown over his face. She got up carefully, pulled her boots on, and went outside. Thorne was at the chopping block 20 yards from the cabin, working through a pile of pine logs, with the focus of a man who wasn't thinking about anything except the next swing. He'd already been at it long enough to build a decent stack. He didn't acknowledge her when she appeared in the doorway. She hadn't expected him to. She found the well, drew the water, and started breakfast with what was in the cabin-dried beans, hardtack, a tin of salt, and a small sack of cornmeal she discovered on the bottom shelf. It wasn't much. She made it work. When Thorne came in, he sat down at the table and ate without comment. That was its own kind of acknowledgement. After a minute, he said, "Cornmeal's better with a little ash from the fire mixed in before you cook it. Helps it bind." "I'll remember that. You'll have to." He poured himself coffee from the pot she'd set on the fire and wrapped both hands around the tin cup and looked at her across the table. Not the measuring look from last night. Something more practical than that. "We need to talk about how this works," he said. "I'd like that." He set the cup down. "You're not a guest. I don't have guests. You're here because it was the only move I had in that saloon, and because leaving you there would have been leaving you to something worse than debt. But this cabin runs on work. Everybody pulls weight. That includes you and both those kids." "Agreed." He looked faintly surprised that she hadn't argued. He went on. "Chores first thing every morning. Water from the well, wood stacked, fire maintained. You'll learn to cook on the open fireplace properly, because that stove in town won't always be available. You'll learn to handle a Winchester. I already know how to shoot." He paused. "How well?" "Well enough. My father taught me before he got sick. I'm not a marksman, but I won't embarrass myself." Thorne nodded once. "Good. Then we'll work on accuracy. There's a difference between knowing how to fire a rifle and knowing where to point it when something's coming at you fast." He picked his cup back up. "And you'll need to learn the land, the plants. Which ones can close a wound, and which ones will kill you if you're wrong about what you're looking at." "I'm a nurse," she said, "and a teacher. Plant medicine is something I've already studied, though not Western varieties. Nokani will help with that." "Who's Nokani?" "Kiowa elder. Lives near the east wall of the canyon. He's been here longer than any white settler in this territory. He knows this land the way you know the back of your hand." Thorne stood and carried his cup to the basin. "He's a friend. You'll treat him like one." It wasn't a request. "Of course," Evelyn said. Toby appeared in the doorway, hair sideways, boots already on. Hannah trailed behind him, with her blanket still wrapped around her shoulders like a cape. Thorne looked at them. They looked at him.
"Breakfast is on the table,"
Evelyn said.
"That broke the stalemate."
The kids sat down. Thorne picked up his hat. "After you eat," he said to Toby, "I'll show you how to stack wood so it dries right. After that, the horses need water." Toby straightened up slightly, not eager exactly. He was 12 and trying not to be but interested. "All right," he said, and managed to keep most of the enthusiasm out of his voice. Thorne walked out. Evelyn watched him go, and then poured herself coffee and stood by the fire for a moment and thought about where she was and what she was doing. She'd been sold in a saloon yesterday. Today, she was learning to cook on a canyon hearth and being handed a rifle lesson before noon. Life, she decided, had taken a turn that no letter from a school board had prepared her for. She drank her coffee. Then she got to work. 3 days passed before Thorne told her the truth. Not about everything that would come later, and harder, but about why she was here. And why? The water rights had gone on the table in that saloon without a moment's hesitation. And why a solitary cowboy in an isolated canyon was running a careful and deliberate operation that had nothing to do with breaking horses. He told her on a Tuesday evening, when the kids were asleep and the fire had burned down to low coals, and there was nothing but silence between them and the dark canyon walls outside. He sat at the table with a map spread in front of him, not a commercial map. Hand-drawn, precise, covered in small notations in 2 different sets of handwriting. She'd noticed it the night before, but hadn't asked. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He put his hand on the map. "Vance runs cattle and land. That's the visible business. Underneath it, he runs people. He let that land. Judge Cole writes contracts, debt agreements, for terms, indentured arrangements, all technically within the law. Cause is the law in this county. Between the 2 of them, they've trapped dozens of families. Homesteaders, freedmen, immigrants, anyone who came west with nothing and needed credit to get started." He traced a line on the map with his finger. "The debt never clears. The terms always shift. People work for years and get deeper in, not out." Evelyn looked at the map. She looked at the notations. "You're gathering evidence. Deputy Gideon Cross and I have been building a case for 8 months. Ledgers, contracts, witness statements, land deeds. Things that will hold up in a federal court, not just Cole's kangaroo operation." He paused. "The water deed I put on that table, that was the last significant asset I had. I knew exactly what it cost. I did it anyway." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because what Vance was doing to you in that saloon had a name. Debt peonage. Human trafficking dressed up in legal language." He looked up from the map. "Human beings aren't cattle to be bought and sold with a scrap of paper. Your freedom wasn't granted by me or Vance. It's your natural right from the day you were born." He said it plainly, without decoration. "But to keep it out here, you have to learn how to stand on your own 2 feet. The fire popped softly. Outside, the canyon was so quiet you could hear the wind moving through the high rock passages above them. "Gideon Cross," she said. "I didn't see him in that saloon. He was there. Back corner, plain clothes. He couldn't move against Vance openly. One black deputy against a room full of hired guns. Ends one way, so we work around it." Thorne rolled the map and tied it with a leather cord. "He's the best man I know. Fought in the war with honor. Came out of it and put on a badge because he believed in what the badge was supposed to mean. He stood and carried the map to the shelf behind the stove. Most people who wear one don't take it that seriously." Evelyn folded her hands on the table. "How long before you have enough for a federal case?" "Getting closer." He sat back down. "But Vance has eyes everywhere in this county. When he figures out what we're doing, he'll move. It won't be polite when he does. Then I want to help." He looked at her. "You're already part of it, whether you want to be or not. You came in as evidence, a live example of exactly what Cole's contracts do. What I need from you is to stay alive, stay quiet about the case, and learn what I'm trying to teach you as fast as you can. And the rifle practice. Especially the rifle practice." The lessons started the next morning and didn't stop. The Winchester was a 1,866 model, lever action, smooth from years of use. Thorne set up a line of tin cans on a flat rock ledge 50 yards out and stood behind her with his arms crossed while she worked through the mechanics. She was right. She knew the basics. Her grip was wrong, though, and her breathing was all over the place, and she flinched on the first 3 shots. "Stop anticipating the recoil," he said. "You're shooting before you pull the trigger. Settle your breath first. Let everything go quiet, then fire." She tried again. The 4th shot clipped the edge of the 2nd can. Better. It wasn't praise, exactly, but she'd already worked out that from Thorne Garrett, better was about as enthusiastic as it got. Toby watched from a safe distance, trying to look casual about the fact that he was memorizing every word. By the fourth day, Thorne had the boy doing dry fire practice with an unloaded rifle, teaching him to sight properly and hold steady. Hannah, who was 7 and deeply uninterested in weapons, had instead attached herself to the question of plants and was following Thorne around the canyon on his morning checks, asking questions about every piece of vegetation she encountered. He answered each one with the same blunt brevity he applied to everything else. She didn't seem to mind. She asked another one before he'd finished answering the last. Evelyn watched this and thought that children, given the chance, could find a way to be curious about almost anything. Even a taciturn cowboy in a dry canyon seemed to be interesting enough, if you were 7, and the alternative was boredom. They visited Noconi on the 5th day. The elder lived in a low, well-built structure near the East Canyon wall, surrounded by small, organized plots of growing things. He was older than she'd expected, deep-lined face, silver-white hair, eyes that were calm and sharp and missed nothing. He greeted Thorne with a handshake that turned into a brief, firm grip with both hands. He greeted Evelyn with a nod that communicated more respect than most elaborate greetings she'd received in her life. He spoke English well and didn't waste it. He showed her the medicinal plants of the canyon, not all at once, not overwhelmingly, but in careful sequence. First the ones that closed wounds, then the ones that brought down fever, then the ones that looked almost identical to something deadly, and why you had to know the difference before you touched them. Evelyn had her notebook out immediately. Noconi glanced at it, and then at her. "You write it down," he observed. "I remember better when I write." He nodded. "That is your way. Keep it." He pointed to a plant with narrow gray-green leaves growing along the base of the rock wall. "This one your people call desert sage. We use it differently than the name suggests. I'll show you." She wrote it all down, every word. On the walk back, Thorne was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "He doesn't share that with many people." "I know," she said. "I won't forget it." He nodded and didn't say anything else. But she noticed, in the last light of the afternoon, that something in the set of his shoulders had changed slightly, like a door that had been standing closed for a long time had opened just a crack and let a little of the day inside. It wasn't much, but in a man like Thorne Garrett, she was starting to understand. It was something. The raid came on a Thursday, just before dawn. Evelyn heard the horses, first too many of them, coming fast on the canyon trail, no attempt at quiet. She was already sitting up when Thorne's fist hit the cabin door twice. By the time she had Hannah in her arms and was moving for the back wall, he was inside, Winchester in hand, face completely calm. "Canyon alcoves," he said. "East path. Noconi knows the route. Go now. Don't stop. Don't look back. What about I'll be right behind you?" He picked up his saddlebags with one arm and handed them to Toby. "You carry those. Don't put them down." Toby grabbed the bags without a word and moved for the door. They ran. The east path was narrow and winding, cut into the canyon wall by water that hadn't run through there in decades. Evelyn went first with Hannah Toby, right on her heels, with the saddlebags slapping against his side. Behind them, in the distance, she could hear shouting, then a shot, then 2 more. She ran faster. Noconi was waiting at the entrance to the alcove, as though he'd known they were coming before the sound of the horses had even reached the canyon floor. He said nothing. He gestured for them to follow and led them deeper into the rock, through a passage so narrow she had to turn sideways, and then into an open cave chamber that was hidden so completely by the canyon geometry that you could stand 6 feet from the entrance and never know it was there. She got Hannah settled against the far wall. Toby sat beside her, breathing hard but steady, the saddlebags still on his shoulder. Noconi crouched near the passage entrance and listened. They stayed there for 2 hours. When Thorne came, he came quietly and alone, and with a long gash across his left forearm that he hadn't mentioned and was holding closed with his own hand. Evelyn saw it immediately. "Sit down," she said. "I'm fine. You're bleeding through your fingers." "Sit down." He sat. She had her medical kit in her bag. She'd grabbed it by instinct on the way out, the same way she always did, the same way her mother had taught her that the kit was the first thing and the last thing, and always within reach. She cleaned the gash, which was deep enough to need closing, and threaded her needle by the thin light filtering down from a crack in the rock ceiling above them. "This is going to hurt," she said. "I know," he said. He didn't flinch, not once, through the whole thing. He sat completely still and watched the cave entrance while she worked, and the only sign that he felt anything at all was a single, slow exhale through his nose when she pulled the first stitch through. When she tied off the last stitch and reached for the bandaging, he shifted his weight, and the back of his shirt pulled tight across his shoulders, and she saw it. Scars. Not one or two, a landscape of them, running across his upper back and down toward his ribs. Old ones silvered over. Bullet entry and exit. Something that had torn rather than cut. The record of a man who had been in the middle of terrible things and had come out the other side, changed by all of it. She didn't say anything immediately. She wrapped the arm carefully and tied it off, and then sat back on her heels. "The war?" she asked. His jaw moved. "Some of it, some from after. Border skirmishes?" "Among other things." He pulled his sleeve back down. "You don't have to be polite about it. I know what it looks like. I'm not being polite. I'm being a nurse." She packed the kit back into her bag. "I've dressed wounds from the war before. In a field hospital in Virginia when I was 16, before they decided I was too young to be useful and sent me home." She met his eyes. "I'm not easily shocked." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked away, toward the passage entrance, and was quiet. Outside, the canyon was still. No Coney made a small sound, a single sharp click of his tongue that apparently meant something specific to Thorne, because Thorne's shoulders dropped slightly, and he said, "They're gone." He didn't relax exactly. Men like him, she suspected, never fully relaxed. But the particular quality of readiness in him shifted down from immediate to watchful. And he leaned his back against the rock wall and closed his eyes for a moment. "Vance sent 6 men," he said. "Maybe more. They went through the cabin." "Is it bad?" "Cabin's still standing. They weren't there to burn it. They were looking for the map. Did anything?" He opened his eyes. "No. They stayed in the canyon for 4 days. The alcove system was more extensive than Evelyn had first understood. Nokoni knew passages that opened into chambers large enough to shelter them comfortably, with natural vents that drew smoke upward, so they could have a fire at night without it showing. He and Thorne had used these places before, clearly. There was a cache of supplies in the deepest chamber: dried meat, water, oil for lanterns, stored carefully and recently checked. Thorne spent the days teaching Toby the things the boy was hungry to learn. How to read the canyon, where the horses could be hidden and fed, how to move quietly on rock without losing your footing. He was patient with the boy in a way that Evelyn noticed and filed away, not soft, not indulgent, but genuinely patient, explaining a thing once clearly and then letting the kid try it and fail and try again. Hannah went back to following Nokoni. The elder had produced a small hand loom from his cache of supplies and was teaching her a basic weaving pattern, which she was executing with a concentration that blocked out the entire rest of the world. The two of them sat in a patch of late afternoon sun that came through a high crack in the canyon wall and worked in companionable silence. Hannah's small hands moving carefully through the threads. Nokoni's occasional correction quiet and precise. Evelyn treated the injured arm twice a day and watched for infection. There was none. Thorne's constitution, she decided, was probably made out of the same material as the canyon walls. At night, the fire burned low, and the kids slept, and the canyon was very quiet. The first night, she and Thorne sat on opposite sides of the fire and said nothing for a long time. The second night, she asked him about the war, and he answered in short pieces, leaving long spaces between them, like he was pulling the words up from somewhere deep, and they didn't come easy. He'd fought for the Union. He'd been 21 at Antietam. He'd done things that were necessary and things that were ordered. and, in a few cases, things that were both necessary and ordered, and that he still couldn't entirely live with. The worst ones aren't the ones that were wrong, he said, staring at the fire. The worst ones are the ones where you did exactly what you were supposed to do, and it still tears at you, because you know what it cost. He turned the stick he'd been using to stir the coals and set it down. I came out here after the war because I needed somewhere that was bigger than me. The canyon helps, does it? She asked, not testing him, genuinely asking. He was quiet, mostly. He glanced up at the crack of sky visible above the canyon wall, thick with stars, on the good nights. She didn't push it further. She understood the difference between a man opening a door and a man ready to walk through it. Those were two different things, and only one of them was his to decide. The third night, Toby asked Thorne about the horses, and something happened to the conversation then that Evelyn watched with quiet attention. Thorne started talking, not more than usual, not in long speeches, but he talked about horses the way people talk about things they love without quite knowing they love them. How to read a wild horse's posture. How to earn its attention before you tried to earn its trust. How trust, once given by an animal that didn't give it easily, was about the most honest thing in the world, because animals didn't give it out of obligation or politeness. They gave it because you'd earned it. Toby was asleep before the story wound down. Thorne noticed, stopped talking, and stood up to put more wood on the fire. Evelyn smiled at the flames and said nothing. On the fourth night, after Nokoni had gone to his own rest and the kids were deep under their blankets, she and Thorne sat close to the fire because the temperature in the canyon dropped sharply after midnight, and neither of them had mentioned moving away from the warmth. The canyon walls rose around them like the sides of a cathedral, and the stars through the gap above were extraordinarily dense and white, and so numerous they seemed to hum. Paladuro, she said. What, the canyon? I've been reading about it. The name comes from a Spanish word for hardwood. She looked up at the walls. I keep thinking about how old this rock is. How many people have sheltered in these same alcoves? She paused. It makes the problems feel smaller, or maybe just more proportionate. Thorne was looking at the same walls. Nokoni says the canyon remembers everything, everyone who's passed through it. Every fire that's been lit here. He said it without self-consciousness. I used to think that was just a way of talking. Now I'm not sure it isn't just a different way of being accurate about something real. The fire settled. Sparks lifted and drifted upward toward that strip of stars. She looked at his profile in the firelight, the hard line of his jaw, the scar, the particular stillness that he carried like a man who had learned the hard way, that stillness was sometimes the only thing between you and the next disaster. He was a difficult man, and a guarded one, and he trusted almost nothing and almost nobody, and he was, underneath all of that, something she was increasingly sure was worth knowing. She didn't say any of this. She pulled her blanket tighter and watched the fire, and beside her, Thorne did the same, and the canyon held them both in its long, indifferent, quietly magnificent silence. Tomorrow there would be more work, more lessons, more careful steps in the direction of justice. In a county that didn't want justice served, there would be danger, and the daily effort of keeping two children safe and healthy, and learning in the middle of all of it. But tonight the stars were out, and that, for now, was enough. The saddlebags had sat on the shelf above the fireplace for 2 weeks, without Evelyn giving them a second thought. Toby had carried them out of the cabin the night of the raid, without putting them down. Once she'd noticed that, noticed the way the boy had treated them, as if his life depended on not losing them, because Thorne had told him to, and Toby, somewhere in those 2 weeks, had decided that Thorne's instructions were worth following exactly. The bags had come back to the cabin when they did, gone up on the shelf, and that was where they stayed. Thorne was out with the horses. Nokoni had taken Hannah to check the east plots. Toby was down at the water trough, working through the wood stacking system. Thorne had shown him with the focused energy of a kid. who'd found something he was genuinely good at. Evelyn was reorganizing the medical supplies on the workbench when she knocked the saddlebag off the shelf. It fell open on the floor. A leather-bound folder slid out and landed face up at her feet. She picked it up. She was going to put it back. She genuinely was. But the folder was old, and the leather was soft with handling, and it had fallen open to a page in the middle, and the name at the top of that page was her father's, Robert J. Mercer, Private, 3rd Ohio Infantry. Deposition, 1869. She sat down on the floor right where she was and started reading. It took a long time. There were 4 letters, 2 official depositions, a hand-drawn diagram of a mine shaft, and a single page in her father's own handwriting. She recognized it immediately. The slightly crooked capital letters, the way he always pressed too hard with the pen that was addressed to no one in particular and had clearly never been sent. By the time she heard Thorne's boots on the porch, she had read everything twice. He came through the door and stopped. She was sitting at the table by then. The folder was open in front of her. She had her hands flat on the table, on either side of it, and she looked up at him with an expression that she couldn't have described and didn't try to. He looked at the folder. He looked at her. Something crossed his face that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite relief. Something in between, from a man who had been carrying a thing for a long time and had known, somewhere, that the carrying couldn't go on indefinitely. He took his hat off and hung it on the door peg and came to the table and sat down across from her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "You knew my father," she said finally. "Yes, you served with him." "Same regiment, different company, but we were at Shiloh together and Chickamauga." He put his hands on the table loosely. He was a good man, steady under fire, looked out for the men around him, even when it cost him. The folder says Vance framed him. Vance wanted the silver mine on your family's land. Your father didn't want to sell. So Vance went to Judge Cole, and they manufactured a debt-backdated contracts, forged signatures, and drove your father into a financial hole deep enough that by the time he understood what had happened, the legal machinery was already running against him. He paused. Your father fought it for 2 years. He couldn't beat Cole's courts. Evelyn looked down at the folder, at her father's handwriting. He got sick, she said. Yes. And before he died, he made you swear an oath. She said it without looking up. To protect me. Thorne didn't answer immediately. He asked me, Thorne said carefully, and I said yes, because he was my comrade and he was dying, and he was frightened for his children. He stopped. But I want to be clear about something. I put those water rights on the table in that saloon because what Vance was doing was wrong, because a human being was being sold in public for a manufactured debt, and I was the only person in that room with the means to stop it. He held her gaze. The oath is why I was in Iron Ridge looking for you. It's not why I did what I did. She sat with that. It was a careful distinction. She understood it. She also understood that understanding a thing and being entirely at peace with it were 2 different operations, and the second one took longer. You should have told me, she said. Yes. From the beginning. Yes. He didn't make excuses. I told myself you had enough to manage without adding the weight of your father's story on top of it. That was my judgment to make, and it was wrong. You deserved to know. She closed the folder slowly. The fire popped. Outside, she could hear Toby moving around, near the woodpile, the clean sound of split logs being stacked. She thought about her father, about the letters he'd sent in the last year of his life that she'd read as the words of a man who was tired and ill and losing hope. She'd thought the illness had broken him. Now she understood it wasn't the illness alone. It was the systematic, deliberate destruction of everything he'd built, by men who wanted what was his and had the legal machinery to take it. Knowing that didn't make it better. But it named it correctly, and naming a thing correctly mattered. It meant you understood what you were dealing with. The silver mine, she said, still registered in your father's name. Vance claimed it by the same forged deed process, but because your father contested it in writing before he died, There's a legal question that Cole couldn't entirely eliminate. That's part of what Gideon and I are building the case around. He watched her carefully. It would belong to you. Legally, if we can get a federal court to void Cole's instruments. She looked up. How much is it worth? A fair amount. Is that why Vance was so determined to acquire me through that debt contract? Because he knew who I was? Almost certainly. You arriving in Iron Ridge wasn't a coincidence from his end. Cole arranged the job posting. The whole thing was constructed to get you into a debt arrangement before you knew what was happening. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, my father trusted you. He did. Did you deserve it? Thorne's jaw moved. He thought about it. Honestly, without rushing to an answer. I tried to, he said at last. I don't know if that's the same thing. She stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the canyon in the afternoon light. The red walls, the wide sky, the small figure of Toby moving purposefully near the woodpile. She had come west with 2 orphan children, a medical kit, and the belief that a job and a fresh start were waiting for her. Instead, she'd found a manufactured trap, a saloon auction, a laconic cowboy with a dead man's promise in his saddlebags, and a silver mine she'd never heard of. She'd also found, she thought, looking at the canyon, at Noconi's small garden visible in the distance, at Hannah's blanket draped over the rock she'd claimed as her sitting spot, something that was beginning to feel, against all reasonable expectation, like a place. She turned around. I'm not angry at you, she said. I want to be clear about that. I'm angry at Vance and Cole and every man who sat in that saloon and watched and said nothing. She met his eyes. But I needed you to know that I know. And I needed you to understand that if there's going to be trust between us, it has to move in both directions. No more deciding what I can handle. He held her gaze. Agreed, all of it from here. Whatever you and Gideon are working on, whatever comes next. I'm not a person to be managed. I'm a partner or I'm nothing. Understood. She nodded once. Then she picked up the folder and handed it back to him. Put this somewhere safer than a saddlebag. If Vance's men had found it in the cabin, I know. He took it. I'll get it to Gideon by the end of the week. She went back to the medical supplies. Her hands were steady. Her mind was working through the new shape of things, reconfiguring what she knew against what she now understood. It was a lot to carry. She carried it. After a while, without looking up from the bandaging she was folding, she said, what was he like? My father. When you knew him? Thorne sat down on the bench near the fire. He was quiet for a moment, and then he started talking, not in the stilted, careful way he usually spoke. Differently. Like the words were coming from somewhere, he didn't guard as carefully. He talked for almost an hour. She listened to every word. Nobody had predicted the blizzard. That was the thing about mountain weather in West Texas. It moved on its own schedule and didn't consult anyone. One afternoon, the sky was pale blue and cold but clear. By nightfall, clouds had stacked up over the canyon rim in a way that Noconi looked at once and said, simply, go inside. Stay inside. Thorne had ridden out that morning to meet Gideon Cross at the arranged point 3 miles east of the canyon, where the ridge dropped low enough to pass without being seen from the main road. He'd taken the leather folder with him and a list of witness names Evelyn had helped him compile from her recollections of the saloon, every face she'd cataloged and every name she'd heard spoken. He wasn't back by dark. By the time she put the kids to sleep, the wind had picked up enough to find every gap in the cabin walls, and the temperature had dropped so fast it felt personal. She kept the fire high and sat up with her coat on and her boots near the door, and watched the window go from black to white as the snow came in fast and heavy and total. Thorne came back at roughly 10 o'clock, covered in snow from hat to boot, moving stiffly in a way that told her the cold had been working on him for a while. The meeting point cave, he said, before she could ask. Gideon took the documents. He's riding for the Federal Circuit Office in Abilene. Is that far? 4 days in good weather. He left before this hit. He should be clear of it. He stood by the fire and let the warmth work into him. His hands were red with cold. She handed him the coffee pot without comment, and he poured a cup and held it in both hands the same way he had on the first morning. She went to check the kids, both deeply asleep. Hannah burrowed entirely under her blankets, Toby, with his arm over his face as always. She pulled their covers straight and came back out and found Thorn still at the fire. "No Coney?" she asked. "He's in his alcove. He has stores, and he's better prepared for this than we are." He set down the cup. "This is going to run through the night and probably most of tomorrow. The canyon will hold the worst of it out. But it's going to be cold." It was already cold. The fire was eating through the wood faster than she'd expected. "How much wood do we have stacked?" He did the calculation in his head. "Enough for tonight, if we're careful. Toby's stacks are further back from the cabin. They'll be under snow by morning. Then we manage what we have." He nodded. "Keep it low and steady. More efficient than burning it high." She adjusted the fire and they sat, opposite sides of the hearth, same as always. But the cabin was small and the cold was pressing in from every direction. And the space between them was less a matter of choice than available geography. The wind hit the cabin in gusts that made the walls creak and sent the fire sideways. An hour in, she could see her breath. She pulled her blanket around her shoulders. He had his coat still on and was sitting forward with his elbows on his knees, watching the fire. "Your arm," she said. He glanced at the bandaged forearm. "Still fine? Let me look." He held it out without argument. She unwrapped it in the firelight and checked the stitches and the surrounding skin. Clean. Healing properly. She rewrapped it, and his arm was cold under her hands, and the warmth from the fire barely reached this far from the hearth. She didn't say what she was thinking immediately. She thought about it practically the way she thought about every medical question. Two people, inadequate heat, a temperature that was still dropping, a fire they couldn't afford to run high. The calculation was simple. "We should pull the bedrolls closer together," she said, "and sleep near the fire. Body heat is more efficient than anything else we've got available tonight." He looked at her. "I can manage. I know you can manage. I'm talking about managing intelligently." She met his eyes steadily. "I'm a nurse. I've spent enough time in field conditions to know that pride is the least useful thing when the temperature drops below freezing. This is practical." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right." They rearranged the bedrolls, hers and his side by side, close to the hearth, close enough to the fire that they'd feel it, close enough to each other that the shared warmth could do its work. She went to check the kids one more time. Still asleep, still warm enough, their corner of the cabin, sheltered by the stove's residual heat. When she came back, Thorn was on his bedroll, still in his coat, his face angled toward the ceiling. She lay down on hers and pulled the blanket over, and the warmth between them was immediate and real. The fire settled. The wind kept hitting the walls. Outside, there was nothing but white. She didn't know exactly when the night shifted. It happened gradually, the cold and the closeness and the long silence and the particular quality of being two people who had been through something together, who had shown each other things that didn't get shown lightly, who had arrived somewhere without entirely intending to. She was aware of him beside her, aware of the warmth, aware that the distance between practicality and something else had been narrowing for days without either of them naming it. He turned his head and looked at her. She looked back. There was no performance in it, no rush, just two people in a small cabin in a blizzard, each of them understanding that whatever came next was a choice they were making clearly and without confusion about what it was. She reached out and put her hand on his. His fingers turned and closed around hers. The fire burned, low and steady. The blizzard pressed against the walls. What passed between them that night was theirs, honest and unhurried and real. The kind of thing that didn't need an audience or an explanation. She woke to light, not firelight, daylight thin and pale and white, filtering through the window in the particular way that snow-reflected morning comes in, brighter than it has any right to be. She lay still for a moment, looking at the ceiling. Then she turned over. The bedroll beside her was empty. The blanket was folded. Not left in a heap, folded carefully and placed to one side. His coat was gone. His hat was gone. His boots were gone. She sat up and looked at the room. On the floor beside the empty bedroll, she found his leather neck thong. The one he wore every day, the one she'd seen him adjust 100 times without thinking about it. She'd noticed it in the early days, and noticed it had something small on it, a ring or a token. She'd never been close enough to see clearly. It was lying on the stone floor in a small coil. Beside it, a dark stain that took her a moment to recognize. Blood, still wet. Her breath left her all at once. She was on her feet before she decided to move, crossing to the door, pulling it open onto a world, completely transformed the canyon, under 1.5 feet of snow, absolute white in every direction, the air so cold and still, it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Boot prints led away from the cabin. One set, deep and deliberate, heading toward the canyon mouth, heading toward the sound she could now hear horses, moving fast on the snow, coming in from the main trail. Not one horse, several. She stood in the doorway and understood what he'd done. He'd woken before dawn, found sign of Vance's hunting party approaching through the snow, and he'd walked out to draw them away, away from the cabin, away from her, away from Toby, and Hannah asleep in the corner. He had walked out into the snow with his bloody neck thong left on the floor like a stone dropped to mark a trail, and he had gone toward the danger on purpose. She was still standing there when the cabin door at her back flew open from the inside, and then, half a second later, the sound of horses reached the front, and around the curve of the canyon wall, 4 men rode into sight with rifles across their saddles, and the man at the front looked at her, standing in the doorway, and smiled the smile of a man who had found exactly what he was looking for. Behind her, she heard Hannah wake up and say her name. The man raised his rifle. They didn't let her bring the medical kit. One of Vance's men grabbed it off the shelf, while the other 2 herded Toby and Hannah out the door, and she said, very clearly, "That bag stays with me." And the man looked at her and set it back down and picked up her coat instead and threw it at her face. She put the coat on and picked up the medical kit and walked out the door ahead of him. Nobody stopped her. Small victories, she cataloged it and kept moving. The ride back to Iron Ridge took most of the morning. They put her and the kids on a single spare horse, Toby behind her and Hannah in front, and the 4 gunmen rode around them in a loose formation that wasn't quite aggressive enough to be called an escort, and wasn't loose enough to be called anything else. The snow was melting fast in the morning sun, turning the trail to mud and slush. The horses moved carefully. She spent the ride doing 2 things. Keeping Hannah calm with quiet conversation about nothing important, the color of the snow, the birds she could see on the rock ledges, a question about what kind of flower she thought might grow near the trail in spring, and thinking. Thorne had left his neck thong. That was deliberate. He'd wanted her to find it, to understand what he'd done and why. The blood was real. He'd been hurt before he left, or on his way out, but he'd walked out under his own power and with his own plan, which meant he was alive when he left the cabin, and he was trying to stay that way. Gideon Cross had the documents. He was 4 days from Abilene in good weather, and the snow was already clearing. That was the work Thorne would not want destroyed. So whatever happened in Iron Ridge in the next few days, the case was still moving. She held on to that. Iron Ridge in winter looked worse than it had in summer, which she hadn't thought was possible. The main street was churned mud and gray slush. The buildings looked smaller and colder, and more defeated than she remembered. People moved quickly between doorways with their coats pulled up, not looking at each other. Vance was waiting in front of the courthouse. He had a new jacket on dark wool, well cut, and a smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "Miss Mercer," he said. "I'd say welcome back, but you never really left properly." She didn't answer him. He looked at Toby and Hannah. "Take the children to Mrs. Hollis's boarding house. They'll be fed," he said it to one of his men, Not to her, which was a deliberate choice she noted and filed. Miss Mercer will be comfortable in the jail until tomorrow. The children stay with me. That wasn't a question. She looked at the man who'd been given the instruction. He was avoiding her eyes. She looked at the other men. Same story. She looked back at Vance. If something happens to those children, she said quietly, there will be no corner of any federal territory where you will be safe from the consequences. I want you to hear that clearly. Vance's smile stayed exactly where it was. Put her in the jail. They put her in the jail. It was a single cell, cold, with a cot and a blanket and a barred window that looked out on the side of the building next door. She sat on the cot and went through her medical kit to confirm nothing had been taken. Everything was there. She organized it carefully, which was something to do with her hands while her mind worked. Judge Cole came to see her that evening. He was a thin man with a precise manner, the kind of person who had decided very early in life that rules were for other people, and had been constructing elaborate justifications for that belief ever since. He sat down on the other side of the bars, in a chair someone had brought for him, and crossed one leg over the other and looked at her with the expression of a man conducting a business transaction. You've put yourself in a complicated position, he said. You put me in a cell, she said. I'd call that your complication, not mine. The charges are theft and flight from contracted debt. The evidence is sufficient for this county. The contract was forged. That's a serious allegation. It's an accurate one, she met his eyes, and I'm not the only person who knows it. Something shifted in his face, very small, very controlled. I'd be careful about making claims you can't support. I have a habit of only making claims I can support. She folded her hands in her lap. How's your forgery technique, Judge? Is it good enough to survive a federal review? He stood up and buttoned his jacket. Get some rest, Miss Mercer. Tomorrow is going to be a long day. He left. She lay back on the cot and stared at the ceiling and rested, because he was right about that part at least. Tomorrow was going to be a long day, and she intended to be ready for it. They built the wooden crate in the town square overnight. It was a low platform, really rough boards, nailed together about 2 feet off the ground, in the clear space in front of the courthouse, where the whole street could see it. Evelyn saw it from the jail window before they came to get her, already understanding what it was for. She put her coat on, and she picked up her medical kit, and when the deputy opened the cell door, she walked out first. The square was crowded, more people than she'd expected. Iron Ridge didn't have that many residents, which meant people had come in from the surrounding homesteads and farms, drawn by whatever story Vance's men had been spreading. She scanned faces as they walked her across the mud. Farmers, shopkeepers, a few women with children, some of Vance's hired hands stationed at the edges of the crowd, and at the back, near the corner of the feed store, a flash of silver that might have been a badge. She kept walking. She didn't look again. Vance stood beside the platform with Judge Cole. Cole had papers. He always had papers. It was his particular form of armor, surrounding himself with documents as though legality was a physical material you could stack high enough to hide behind. Miss Evelyn Mercer, Cole announced, in his court voice, which was designed to carry and to sound like authority. Having fled contracted service and absconded with property belonging to Mr. Jebediah Vance, and having incurred additional debt during her flight, is hereby presented for public auction to satisfy outstanding obligations as permitted under County Statute 12, paragraph that statute was struck down by the federal legislature in 1867. She said it clearly, not shouting, clear and even and loud enough to carry. Cole stopped. Debt peonage was made illegal by federal law following the end of the war, she continued. And any county statute that contradicts federal law is void on its face. Every person in this square knows this or ought to. She looked out at the crowd, not at Vance, not at Cole. At the faces, the contract he's holding is a forgery. The debt is manufactured. This is not a legal proceeding. This is a slave auction dressed up in paper and called something else. And everyone standing here watching it happen is a witness. A murmur ran through the crowd. Vance stepped forward. She's a fugitive making a speech, he said. Don't let her. Your silence in the face of injustice, Evelyn said, raising her voice, is the very chain you wrap around your own necks. The murmur stopped. The square went quiet. She looked at them. A woman near the front with two children holding her hands. An older man in a canvas coat who was gripping his hat brim hard enough to crumple it. A young couple at the side who were looking at each other instead of at her, and in that look she read everything: recognition, fear, the particular expression of people who knew exactly what she was describing because something similar had happened to them. Today it's me, she said. Tomorrow it will be your daughters. The silence stretched. Then Deputy Gideon Cross moved out of the shadow of the feed store and into the open square with his badge on his chest, and his hand not on his gun but visible open at his side. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with the composed bearing of someone who had decided a long time ago what he stood for and had not reconsidered since. His eyes swept the crowd with a calm authority that had nothing to do with the weapon on his hip. I'm placing Judge Cole and Mr. Vance under notice of federal investigation, he said. His voice was steady and clear as a bell. Anybody who's had a debt contract with either of these men, I need you to come see me before you leave this square today. Vance's men moved, 3 of them converging on Gideon fast, and there were too many of them. They got to him before he could draw, and they took his badge off his coat and threw it in the mud, and 2 of them had rifles leveled at, and the third had him by the arm, and Gideon stood in the middle of it and didn't fight them and kept his face completely still. This isn't over, he said to the crowd. To no one in particular, to everyone. They dragged him to the side. Vance turned back to the crowd and spread his hands. Business resuming, the machine grinding back into motion. But Evelyn watched the faces in the square. The woman with the 2 children, the old man in the canvas coat, the young couple. Nobody had moved to help, not yet. But something in the crowd had cracked. She could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm, not visible, not certain, but real. Evelyn's words were in the air now, and words, once said out loud in front of witnesses, had a way of working on people, even when people weren't ready to admit it. She stood on the wooden platform in the cold and kept her chin up and waited. The rain started that night. By morning it was serious. The kind of rain that came in from the south in winter and meant business cold and heavy and relentless, turning Iron Ridge's main street into a channel of brown water and mud that sucked at boots and wheel rims and made every surface treacherous. Evelyn was back in the jail cell. Gideon was in the cell beside her. They'd taken his badge, but not his voice, and they'd talked through the bars for most of the night in low tones, comparing what each of them knew. Thorne? She asked. Alive when I last had word. He drew Vance's hunting party east toward the ridge, bought enough time for the storm to close the trail. Gideon shifted on his cot. He's hard to kill. I've seen people try. He was bleeding when he left. He's been bleeding before. He paused. The documents are with the federal marshal's office. I got them there before I came back. What happens here in the next day or 2 doesn't change that. She let out a breath. How long before the federal marshals arrive depends on who's riding and how fast. 2 days, maybe 3. He was quiet for a moment. We need to still be alive when they get here. She thought about the faces in the square. Something shifted in that crowd yesterday. I saw it. Vance doesn't see it yet. Vance, Gideon said carefully, has been in power long enough that he's stopped watching the small things. That's when it gets dangerous. Not for him. She didn't sleep much, but she rested, which was a different skill and one she'd learned out of necessity in field hospitals. The ability to be still and let the body recover, even when the mind wouldn't fully release. She heard the horses at mid-morning. Not Vance's men. She knew the sound of their horses by now, the particular pattern of a group, moving with the loose, unhurried confidence of people who thought they owned the ground they were riding on. This was different, More horses, moving fast, and under the rain, she could hear voices she didn't recognize, and one she did. The jail door banged open. One of Vance's deputies came in fast and went for the rifle rack on the wall, and then stopped because Thorne Garrett was in the doorway behind him, with a Colt leveled at the center of his back. Thorne looked terrible. He had a bandage wrapped around his left side under his open duster, dark in one spot, in a way that told her. The wound was real and recent. His face was the color of old ash. He'd been riding hard in the rain for hours, and it showed on him. He looked at her through the bars. "You all right?" he said. "I'm fine," she said. "You're bleeding again later." He took the deputy's keys and unlocked her cell, then Gideon's. He handed the deputy's rifle to Gideon without looking and said, "We've got about 4 minutes before this gets complicated." "How many?" Gideon asked. "Vance has 12 men positioned around the square. I came in with 8 homesteaders who've had enough, plus Nokoni and 2 of his people on the ridge above town." He looked at Gideon. "I need you in the square with your badge. They threw it in the mud. It's still there." I walked past it on the way in. Gideon almost smiled. He picked up his coat and walked out. The main street of Iron Ridge in the rain looked like the end of something and the beginning of something else simultaneously. Mud 6 inches deep in the wheel ruts. Rain coming straight down in gray sheets. The buildings on either side with their shutters closed. And in the street, Vance's men and the homesteaders Thorne had brought, fanned out in the rain, rifles and revolvers out, everybody waiting for the first move. Gideon walked to the center of the street and bent down and picked his badge up out of the mud and wiped it on his coat and pinned it back on his chest and straightened up. He put himself between the 2 groups. "Federal investigation is active and documented," he said, loud enough to carry over the rain. "Any man who fires a weapon in this street is firing on a federal proceeding. That's a charge that doesn't expire." Vance came out of the saloon doorway with 4 men behind him. He took in the scene with the particular look of a man whose plan has just acquired unexpected variables. Thorne moved into the street. He stood next to Gideon, a white cowboy, and a black deputy, shoulder to shoulder in the mud and the rain, with water running off both their hats, and neither of them blinking. The standoff held. And then, from the doorway of the saloon, muffled and sudden, a single shot. Vance took it in the shoulder and went down sideways against the doorframe. His men scrambled. Confusion everywhere. Rifles swinging in all directions. Nobody sure where the shot had come from. Evelyn was already moving toward Vance. A man was shot, whatever he was, and she was a nurse when she saw him. Judge Cole. Standing in the shadowed doorway, 10 feet to the left of where Vance had fallen, a small pistol at his side. Looking at Vance with the cold, calculating expression of a man who had just made a business decision and was already moving to the next item on the list. He turned to his own men, the 3 mercenaries he'd kept separate from Vance's operation. "It was the cowboy," he said, pointing at Thorne. "I saw him." He shot Vance. His men raised their rifles. Gideon's voice cracked across the square like a whip. "Nobody moves." Everything stopped. Evelyn looked at Cole, at the pistol still in his hand, at Vance bleeding in the doorway, who was looking at Cole with an expression that had shifted from pain to something slower and much more devastating understanding, arriving about 4 years too late. "He shot you," she said to Vance, clearly, so the crowd could hear it, to eliminate the witness and put the blame somewhere else. Vance's mouth moved. He was losing blood fast, and his color was wrong, but his eyes were on Cole. "You," he said, just the one word. Cole's composure cracked for the first time she'd ever seen. Small crack, quickly controlled. But she'd seen it, and so had Gideon, and so had a square full of witnesses standing in the rain. "The gun is still in his hand," Thorne said. Not to Vance, to the crowd. "Thorne Garrett has not fired his weapon today. You can all see that." He hadn't. His Colt was still holstered. In all the chaos, he hadn't fired once. The mercenaries looked at Cole, then at the crowd, then at each other. Then, one by one, they lowered their rifles. The homesteaders moved in. Gideon went straight for Cole with his hand out. The weapon, Judge. Cole looked around the square, at the faces, at the rifles, at Vance, bleeding in the doorway, who was still watching him with that expression. He handed over the pistol. Gideon took it. He looked at it. He looked at Cole. "You are under arrest," he said, "for attempted murder, forgery, debt peonage, fraud, and conspiracy. You'll be held for federal marshals who are already en route to this county." He put his hand on Cole's arm. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Cole didn't resist. He went still and cold the way a machine goes still when it's switched off, and let Gideon lead him toward the jail. Evelyn was already kneeling in the doorway beside Vance. Coat off, medical kit open. The wound was serious. High in the shoulder, clean through Cole had been close, and the pistol was small caliber, which was the only reason Vance was still conscious. She got pressure on it and reached for the bandaging, and Vance looked down at her working on him with something between confusion and a kind of exhausted resignation. She worked quickly and steadily, the way she always did, and the rain came down around them, and the square gradually exhaled. Behind her, she heard Thorne say her name, not loud, just her name. She looked up. He was standing in the rain with one hand pressed to his left side, and his face had gone from ash-colored to something closer to paper. And she stood up immediately and crossed to him and got her hand over his and pushed. "I told you later," he said. "Later is now," she said. "Sit down." He sat down right there in the mud of the main street, and she knelt beside him and opened her kit again, and around them, Iron Ridge stood in the rain and breathed and didn't look away. They moved Cole's files into the saloon because the courthouse was his territory and nobody wanted to be in his territory anymore. Evelyn sat at the largest table with 3 oil lamps burning and the contracts spread out in front of her in the order she'd determined made the most sense chronological by date of issue, then cross-referenced against the land registry entries she'd pulled from the courthouse files, while Gideon kept watch at the door. Thorne was in the back room with his shirt off and his jaw set, while she stitched the wound in his side, which he was tolerating with the same absolute stillness he brought to everything unpleasant. "Hold that," she said, and he pressed the folded cloth against his ribs while she rethreaded the needle. "How bad?" he asked. "You'll live. You'll also need to stop moving around like you're not injured, or you'll undo everything I'm doing." She pulled the first stitch through. "I mean it." He didn't answer, which was how she knew he'd heard her. She finished the stitching and wrapped him properly, and he put his shirt back on and came out to the main room and looked at the table covered in documents and said nothing for a moment. "The forgeries are in the signature dates," Evelyn said. She pointed to the first contract without sitting down. Cole used a standard notarial seal, but the seal impression changes between 1,869 and 1,871. A real seal doesn't change, it's a physical instrument. If the impression is different, one of them is a copy, and copies were made for a reason. Thorne leaned over the table and looked where she was pointing. "You can see that?" "I worked in a legal office in Cleveland for 8 months before I trained as a nurse. The head clerk was very particular about documentation." She moved to the second group of contracts. "There's more. The debt calculation formula shifts in the 1,870 documents. The interest compounds differently in a way that's mathematically designed to prevent the principal from ever clearing. It's not an error. It's constructed that way." Gideon had come in from the door. He stood at the edge of the table and looked at the documents spread across it. "Can you put it in writing? Something a federal court can follow?" "I can do better than that." She picked up a clean sheet of paper from the courthouse stack. "I can write a cross-reference summary that shows the pattern across every contract, not just the forgery. The system, how the pieces fit together to trap people." She looked at him. "Give me 2 hours." She sat down and started writing. Outside, Iron Ridge was doing something it probably hadn't done in years. It was talking. Not the low, careful, keep your head down murmuring of people who were afraid to be overheard. Real conversation, in the street, in doorways, in the hardware store, where three homesteaders had gathered around the proprietor's counter, with their hats in their hands and their old contracts spread on the counter, and were pointing at things and asking questions and listening to each other's answers. Thorne stood at the saloon window and watched this. His side hurt and his arm hurt, and he was tired in the bone-deep way that came from too many days of too much. But he watched the street, and something in his face slowly settled. Gideon came to stand beside him. "Vance's men have all stood down," he said. "3 of them came to me voluntarily. They want to cooperate with the federal investigation." "Smart," Thorne said. "Scared," Gideon said, "but scared in the right direction, so I'll take it." An hour into Evelyn's work, the door opened, and a man came in. She didn't recognize older, rancher's build, hat twisted in both hands. He looked at Gideon, then at the table, then at her. "I heard there was somebody looking at the contracts," he said. "Sit down," she said, without looking up from the page. "Tell me your name, and when yours was signed, and what they told you it was for." He sat down and started to talking. Before she'd finished her summary, 4 more people had come through the door. She listened to each one. She noted the details that mattered. She added them to the document in a separate section, clearly labeled. At the 2-hour mark, she set down her pen and looked at what she'd written. 12 pages, clear, systematic, cross-referenced at every point. She looked up at Gideon. "This is your evidentiary summary," she said. "Don't lose it." He picked it up carefully and read the first 3 pages without speaking. Then he looked at her over the top of the document. "Where did you learn to do this?" "Cleveland Legal Office." 8 months. She picked up her pen again. "And I'm a teacher. Organizing information so people can understand it is most of what I do." He nodded slowly. "The federal marshals are going to want to talk to you. I'll be here." She stood and moved to the window beside Thorne. The street outside had more people in it now than she'd seen in Iron Ridge at any point. Groups of them, standing together, talking, reading their own contracts, comparing pages with neighbors they'd probably been too frightened to speak to openly for years. Vance was in the back room of the doctor's office, alive and under guard, with a shoulder wound that would heal, and a legal situation that wouldn't. He'd been talking since his color came back. Quietly at first, then more. Gideon had noted all of it, and now, at the far end of the street, one of Vance's men brought out a locked iron safe from the back of the land office. He set it on the street in front of Gideon and handed over the key without being asked. It opened on a stack of papers, original land deeds, unaltered, bearing the real signatures of the families who'd signed them before Cole's machinery had processed them into something else. The crowd moved in to look. A woman at the front found her family's deed third from the top and made a sound that had no word for it. And her husband put his arm around her, and they both stood there in the cold air of the main street, reading their own names in their own signatures on a document that had been used against them for years. And it was theirs. That was when the rage started. It moved through the crowd the way weather moves fast, building, directionless. Someone found a rope. She didn't see where it came from. The crowd pressed toward the jail where Cole's men were being held, and the sound of it was old and ugly and recognizable. Thorne moved before she registered he was moving. He came out the saloon door and put himself between the crowd and the jail. Not with his gun out, just himself standing in the street, one hand raised. "Stop," he said. The crowd's forward movement slowed, but didn't stop. Someone at the back said something she couldn't hear clearly, and the tone of it was bad. The law was made to protect us from the beast inside ourselves. His voice was hard and clear. He looked at the faces in front of him without flinching. "If you string them up out of anger today, you're burying the very civilization we're trying to build with your own hands." The crowd stopped. He stood in the silence and let it settle around them. "These men will face a federal court," he said. "They will be judged by law, on the record, in front of witnesses, with evidence that cannot be ignored or disappeared. That is the only outcome that protects you. Not just today, every day after. This one. He held the silence for another moment. Your anger is right. What was done to you was criminal and deliberate, and it has to be answered. But it has to be answered correctly, or you hand the next man, like Cole, the exact argument he needs to undo everything you're trying to build. The rope went down. Nobody cheered. Nobody moved dramatically. They just stopped. And then, slowly, the crowd began to break into smaller groups. And people began talking again, quieter now, and the moment passed without blood. Gideon picked the rope up off the ground and carried it away without comment. Evelyn looked at Thorne from the saloon doorway. He walked back inside and picked up his coffee cup and stood at the window and said nothing. She said nothing either. Some things didn't need commentary. You just let them be what they were. The federal marshals rode into Iron Ridge on a Thursday morning. 4 of them, with the particular straight-backed efficiency of people who had ridden a long way on a clear purpose. They spent 2 days going through Evelyn's documentation, Gideon's witness statements, Vance's cooperation agreement, and the contents of the safe. On the evening of the second day, the lead marshal, a compact woman named Harlan, with silver-streaked hair and reading glasses on a cord around her neck, declared all forced labor contracts in Iron Ridge County null and void on federal grounds. The declaration was read aloud in the square. Evelyn stood with Hannah on one side and Toby on the other and listened to every word. Afterward, the marshals met with Noconi and 3 representatives from the Kiowa settlement near the canyon. Land rights and water access restored formally and entered into the federal record. Noconi listened to the interpreter relay the terms and then looked across the table at Gideon and nodded. Once, slowly, with the dignity of a man who had been waiting a long time for something to be made right and was not going to diminish the moment by making it smaller than it was. The silver mine documentation took another day. Evelyn signed 4 forms. Gideon witnessed them. The mine legally was hers. She looked at the deed for a long time after the ink dried. She'd never thought much about the mine. It had been an abstraction, a thing her father had, a thing he'd been cheated out of, a thing that sat at the center of the legal case, like a weight. Now it had her name on it, and it felt like holding something that had belonged to someone else. For so long it had almost forgotten what it was. Thorne wasn't at the signing. She found him at the canyon, 3 hours later. In the late afternoon light, he was at the corral with one of the horses, the gray mare he'd been working with for weeks, running his hands along her neck in slow strokes while she stood and let him. His saddlebags were packed and resting on the fence rail. She looked at the saddlebags, then at him. "You're leaving," she said. He didn't pretend surprise. He turned to face her, and he looked tired and scraped clean and honest. "The work here is done. Gideon has it from here. The marshals have what they need." He looked at her steadily. "You have the mine. You have the town. You have everything your father meant for you to have. And you? I'll move on. Find the next canyon." He said it flatly, but she'd known him long enough now to hear what was underneath the flatness. "This was never my place to stay. That's not a reason. That's a habit." He looked away. She stepped forward and took the deed out of her coat pocket, the mine deed, still warm from sitting against her side, and she held it up in front of him for a moment. Then she tore it in half, then in quarters. Then she let the pieces go, and the canyon wind took them and scattered them across the red dirt. He stared at the pieces. She stood in front of him and looked up at his face. "I don't need a silver mine," she said, "and I don't need a guardian angel to keep me safe." She held his gaze. "I need a man who sees me as his equal and stands beside me as my partner." The canyon was very quiet. The gray mare moved softly at the fence. The last light of the afternoon was hitting the west wall in long amber panels, the way it did at this hour, making the rock look warm from the inside. Thorne looked at the scattered pieces of the deed. He looked at her face. He was not a man who showed things easily or quickly, but she could read him now. She'd had enough weeks of quiet evenings and difficult mornings and moments of real consequence to have learned the language of his face. What she saw there now was not complicated. It was just real. The mine could have set up the children, he said. One last argument, thin, and he knew it. The town is being rebuilt. There will be a school. Toby will have work in 5 years if he wants it. Hannah will grow up somewhere that's being made into something honest. She didn't move. The mine was my father's dream, not mine. My dream is standing right in front of me, and he's about to make a very poor decision. Something broke open in his expression, quietly. The way long frozen ground breaks open in spring, no drama, just release. He reached out and took her hand. She closed her fingers around his and held on. The saddlebags stayed on the fence rail. 2 years later, Iron Ridge looked like something someone had decided to believe in. The main street was still mud in wet weather and still too hot in summer. But the buildings had been repaired and painted, and one of them had a new sign above the door that read Mercer School in clean black letters on whiteboard. The sign was slightly crooked because Toby had hung it himself at 14 declining all assistants. And Evelyn had decided that a slightly crooked sign, hung by a boy who'd carried a saddlebag through a blizzard without putting it down, was worth more than a straight one. The school had 3 rooms now. One for the youngest children, one for the older ones, one that doubled as a meeting room in the evenings where adults came for reading lessons and legal literacy sessions that Evelyn had started the previous winter. She'd taught the first session herself. Word got around. Now she had 2 assistants. The schoolhouse doors opened every morning to a line of children that would have been unthinkable 2 years ago. White settler children, and the children of freedmen families who'd come west after the war, and 6 Kiowa children whose parents had accepted the offer extended through Noconi, who had asked for nothing in exchange, except that the curriculum include the history of the land, told honestly. Evelyn had agreed immediately. She wrote the curriculum herself, sitting at the table in the cabin with Noconi across from her, and she asked him questions for 3 evenings, straight, and wrote down everything, and read it back to him and revised it until he said, simply, "That is accurate," which she was learning was the highest form of approval available in his vocabulary. This morning, she was late getting to the school because she'd been checking the herb garden behind the cabin, which was now substantial enough to supply half the remedies she used in her informal medical practice. She still had her kit. She'd just stopped waiting for a doctor to arrive in Iron Ridge and started doing what needed doing herself, which was, she'd come to understand how almost everything in her life had actually happened. Thorne taught from 8 until noon on Tuesdays and Thursdays, not inside. Outside at the corral behind the school, where he showed children how to approach a horse, how to read its posture, how to earn trust from something that didn't give it cheap. He was not by nature a teacher in the formal sense, but the children came back every week and brought their siblings and their cousins, and Evelyn had stopped being surprised about this because she'd had 2 years to observe the fact that Thorne Garrett was profoundly good at demonstrating things, even when he thought he was just doing them. Gideon Cross, elected Marshal of Iron Ridge in the November vote, had won by a margin that surprised him and nobody else. He kept his badge cleaner than any piece of metal in the county. His office was small and well organized, and the cells behind it were rarely occupied, which was what a good lawman's jail looked like. He'd put a copy of the federal declaration, voiding the labor contracts on the wall, behind his desk, in a simple frame. He didn't explain it to visitors. He didn't need to. Noconi still lived near the East Canyon wall. He still tended his plots and taught whoever was willing to learn, which was increasingly a lot of people. He and Hannah had continued the weaving lessons every week for 2 years, and Hannah, now 9, was working on a pattern of her own design that Noconi had looked at and said, "You are past what I can show you. Now you will teach yourself." Hannah had taken this extremely seriously. She had opinions about it that she shared at length, and Evelyn listened to all of them. Toby, 14 and growing fast, had spent the 2 years becoming someone. It was the only way to describe it. He'd worked with Thorne at the corral, and with Gideon on boundary surveys, and with Noconi on the canyon routes, and with Evelyn on everything else. The way a young person absorbs a place when the place is good and the people in it are worth learning from. He was going to be formidable at 20. Evelyn could already see the outline of it. At dusk, Evelyn walked out to the ridge above the canyon, where the view opened up across the prairie, grass and rock and sky in every direction, the horizon so wide it made the problems of any given day feel workable. She heard him before she saw him. His boots on the rock. Then he was beside her, and they stood together and looked out at the West Texas evening. The last light was going gold. Far out across the prairie, a small cluster of lights from a homestead she recognized the Abernathy family, who had gotten their land deed back from the iron safe and had been on it ever since, building something. Thorne put his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against him, and his chin came down close to her ear. "Your innocence belongs to the past, my love," he said, low and quiet, with something in his voice that hadn't been there 2 years ago, and that she was still, honestly, getting used to. "Tonight, your fierce, free soul is mine." She turned her head and looked at his profile in the fading light. He wasn't talking about ownership. She'd known that the moment he said it, because she knew him. He was talking about witnessing, about being the person who stood next to someone and saw them clearly and chose to keep standing there. She reached up and covered his hands with hers. Below them, the canyon held its long memory of every fire that had been lit in it, every person who had sheltered in its red walls, every story that had played out under its enormous sky. And ahead, the prairie went on into the dark, vast and open, and full of everything that hadn't happened yet. Their fingers intertwined beneath the stars. The West had been many things, hard and beautiful and brutal and enormous. It had been a trap and a refuge and a test, and in the end something she hadn't had a word for until she'd lived inside it long enough to understand. It was a place where, if you were brave enough and stubborn enough and willing to stand up on a wooden crate in a hostile crowd and say the true thing out loud, you could build something that mattered. Not perfect, not finished, just honest, and moving forward, and real. That was enough. That was, it turned out, everything. And that's where we leave them, Evelyn and Thorne, standing on a ridge above Palo Duro Canyon, fingers intertwined beneath a sky full of West Texas stars. Not a perfect ending, not a fairy tale, just two people who chose each other, honestly, after everything the world threw at them. But before we close the book on Iron Ridge, I want to talk about what this story is really about, because it isn't just a romance. It never was. When Evelyn stepped off that stagecoach in 1872, she walked straight into a system designed to break her. A forged contract, a manufactured debt, a courtroom controlled by the very man running the crime. Everything about that setup was meant to make her feel small, powerless, and alone. And for a moment, just a moment, it worked. She trembled. We all would have. But here's the thing about Evelyn Mercer. She didn't wait to be rescued. She picked up her medical kit. She walked out the door first, and she started learning. The rifle, the land, the plants, the law. She turned every hard day into a lesson, and every lesson into armor. By the time she stood on that wooden crate in the town square and looked out at a crowd too afraid to speak, she wasn't trembling anymore. She was the one making other people think. That's the first thing this story gives us. The reminder that knowledge is the one thing no one can take from you once you have it. Evelyn's education, formal and informal, Eastern and Western, medical and legal, was her real weapon throughout this entire story. Not the Winchester, not Thorne, her mind, her preparation, her refusal to stay ignorant about the world she was living in. The second thing is about silence. There's a line Evelyn delivers from that auction platform that I keep coming back to. Your silence in the face of injustice is the very chain you wrap around your own necks. She wasn't just talking to Iron Ridge in 1872. She was talking to every one of us who has ever seen something wrong and looked away because getting involved felt too costly or too complicated or too dangerous. The townspeople in this story weren't evil. They were afraid. And fear dressed up as neutrality is still a choice, just one that serves whoever is in power. Evelyn named that, out loud, in public, and it cracked something open in people that all of Vance's hired guns couldn't close back up. The third thing is about justice versus revenge. When the crowd found that rope, their anger was completely understandable. These were people who had been robbed, trapped, and humiliated for years by men who used legal language as a weapon. They had every emotional reason to want immediate, violent satisfaction. And Thorne, a man who had seen more violence than most people in that crowd could imagine, stood between the rope and the prisoners and said no. Not because Cole and Vance deserved protection, but because the community deserved better than becoming what it was trying to defeat. Real justice is slow and procedural, and sometimes deeply unsatisfying in the short term. But it's the only kind that actually holds. And then there's Thorne and Evelyn themselves. What I love most about their relationship is that it was never about saving and being saved. Thorne put that water deed on the table, not because he thought Evelyn was helpless, but because he was the one person in that room with the specific means to act. Evelyn tore up that silver mine deed, not because she was being romantic, but because she understood that a partnership built on obligation and gratitude would never be equal ground. They both had to earn the other. That's what made it real. Equal respect, mutual accountability, and the willingness to tell each other the hard truth, even when it cost something. That is the kind of love that actually lasts. So whatever you take from this story, whether it's the history, the romance, the justice, or just the sheer satisfaction of watching a corrupt system finally fall apart, I hope it leaves you thinking about the people in your own life who are standing on their own version of that wooden crate, saying true things into a silent crowd. And I hope it leaves you thinking about whether you're one of the people who finally speaks up. Iron Ridge got rebuilt, not because it was easy, but because enough people decided that what they were building mattered more than what they were afraid of. That's always how it happens. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment and storytelling purposes only. All characters, events, organizations, and locations depicted are entirely fictional and do not represent any real persons, living or dead, or actual historical events. While the narrative is set against a broadly historical backdrop, it does not claim historical accuracy and should not be taken as a factual account of any period, place, or people. Any resemblance to real individuals or real events is purely coincidental. Viewer discretion is advised for themes including systemic injustice, historical labor exploitation, and depictions of conflict.